My name is Zachary Quintero. I serve with you on the people of our state as the Executive Director for the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Welcome to your home. I want to first thank both the Consul of Mexico, the Latin American Iberian Institute, the Guadalupe Institute for the Western Hemisphere Center for the collaboration and the focus on this important topic between the United States and our familia, Mexico. Right? No other way of saying it, for the story of Nuevo Mexico, el alma del Nuevo Mexico es Mexico también. So I also want to say a special thank you to Executive Director Francisca Yoshida from the Latin American and Iberian Institute for the University of New Mexico, as well as the Consulado de Mexico. So thank you so much for the continued collaboration for this kind of conversation to happen. We at the National Hispanic Cultural Center are focused on promoting, protecting, and advancing Hispano, Latino, and Indigeno American arts, and making sure we do so not just because we are the only National Hispanic Cultural Center in the entire United States, but because of the purpose we bring to be able to protect, preserve, and advance our gente on all fronts. So muchas gracias, familia, and enjoy the panel tonight. Gracias to our panelists as well.
So thank you all for coming today. I'm Francisca Yoshida. I'm the director of the Latin American and Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. And our mission is to promote research, teaching, and outreach related to Latin America and Iberia. It's a thrill to be able to welcome you all here. I want to express my thanks to the NHCC and to the Consul of Mexico, to Executive Director Zach Quintero, and to Consul Patricia Pinzón. And I particularly want to thank the Western Hemisphere Center of the Guadalupe Institute for their generous support of this event. And the center is dedicated to promoting respectful dialogue, and I think events like this are very much a part of that mission. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for the panel, who will in turn take things over and introduce our distinguished panelists. Career diplomat Patricia Pinzón Sánchez has served as a Consul of Mexico at Albuquerque, New Mexico since May 31st, 2024. Her jurisdiction includes 24 counties in New Mexico and 38 in Northwest Texas. She has over 20 years of experience at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working for several Mexican consulates in California and Arizona. She holds a BA in International Relations from the Instituto, Tecnológico, Autónomo de México, and a master's in U.S.-Mexico border studies from the Colegio de la Frontera Norte. She's also previously served at the Institute of Mexicans Abroad in Mexico City and has been a member of the Mexican Foreign Service since 2010, and has also been someone who has been wonderful to partner with. So please join me in welcoming Consul Pinzón Sánchez.
Good afternoon, thank you very much. I want to thank the University of New Mexico Institute for Latin American and Iberian Studies for organizing this panel, and the National Hispanic Cultural Center for hosting us. Thank you so much, Francis. Thank you, Zach. It is my pleasure to moderate this panel on the future of U.S.-Mexico relations with such a level of experts in the bilateral relation. Please allow me to briefly introduce them. Dr. Abelardo Rodríguez Humano is a professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, as well as a member of the National Council on Science and Technology of Mexico. He was Vice President of the Mexican International Studies Association and the United Kingdom Mexico Visiting Chair at King's College, London. He has a PhD in International Studies from the University of Miami. He is a visiting professor at the Mexican Navy in the PhD in Security and Defense program, and is a specialist in Mexican national security, U.S.-Mexico relations, North America, and international security. Welcome, Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Jorge Schiavon is a professor of international relations at the International Studies Department of Universidad Iberoamericana, Ibero, in Mexico City. He's a member of the National Researchers System in Mexico and Vice President of the Centro de Estudios sobre la Política Exterior de México, CESPEM. He holds a PhD in Political Science and International Affairs from the University of California, San Diego, an MA in Political Science from UCSD, a BA in International Relations from el Colegio de México, and a diploma in Public International Law from the Hague Academy of International Law, International Court of Justice. Welcome, Dr. Schiavone. Dr. Rafael Velázquez is an International Relations Professor at the School of Economics and International Relations of the Autonomous University of Baja California, UABC. He holds a PhD in International Studies from the University of Miami. He was a fellow at the U.S.-Mexican Studies Center of the University of California, San Diego. He currently holds the Mexico Studies Chair of the Fulbright Program at the University of New Mexico with the Latin American and Iberian Institute. Welcome, Dr. Velázquez.
Thank you.
The United States-Mexico bilateral relation is unique in the world, bound by a close to 2,000-mile shared border with over 50 lands port of entry that connect both countries to some of the deepest social, commercial, cultural, geographical, and historical ties built through over 200 years. For its nature and complexity, it is as well one of the most challenging relations worldwide. In their most recent book, The U.S.-Mexico Relations, Structuring Alternative Futures, the authors anticipate scenarios to plan for possible situations, what could happen in a short, a medium, or a long term. The authors investigate the past to understand the present and outline possible future scenarios that, depending on the variables, may switch from the continuity to the disruptive, the desirable, the negative, or even the unexpected, identifying the key drivers that are likely to determine the future, and providing the reader with a broad range for analysis and reflection while producing policy recommendations. Without further ado, it is my pleasure now to ask Dr. Abelardo Rodriguez to present the content of his most recent book, U.S.-Mexico Relations, Structuring Alternative Futures. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you so much for this very kind presentation. I want to thank to all of you for being here in this beautiful city. It's my first time that I'm in Albuquerque, in Mexico. And it's fascinating to share this new book. And I want to thank to Consul of Mexico in Albuquerque, Patricia Pinzón Sánchez, for this opportunity, to Dr. Francis Hayashida from the Latin American and Iberian Institute of the University of New Mexico, to Rafael Velázquez, the visiting professor here at the University of New Mexico, and the National Hispanic Cultural Center. This book is the second volume in terms of the U.S.-Mexico relationship that Iberoamericana University and the Center for U.S.-Mexico Studies, University of Rice in Houston, we have addressed. We presented this book 2 weeks ago in Washington at the National Defense University at Johns Hopkins University. We had another presentation also at Universidad Iberoamericana. And I want to emphasize just so few ideas about this topic that is crucial in terms of the bilateral relationship. First is in terms of the research project that we have undertaken for this publication. is that in terms of the US-Mexico relationship, it's quite fundamental to look at the great power competition between China, Russia, and of course the US. This is like the nobility of our project. Then, and this approach is that simultaneously we are looking at the interdependent dynamic of both Mexico and the US, and simultaneously we are looking up to North America and down to Central, the Caribbean, and of course Latin America, in order to have a comprehensive approach to the US-Mexico relationship. We are looking simultaneously north and south. In this sense, we believe that taking into account the great power competition, global dimensions such as global warming, pandemics, and a series of different global and post-conflicts in the case of Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas, we believe that the key equation of the US-Mexico relationship is in the regional component of the integration process. In this sense, it's also important that we have some scholars that they have been taking part of the national security structure of the US, like Craig Dare. He has a chapter on the US national security toward Mexico. Or Tomas Martinez, who has worked in the National Palace in Mexico and several different ministries in Mexico. And also we have top academics on trade, migration, energy, foreign policy, like my colleagues here, Jorge Esquiabon and Rafael Velázquez. And also we have some chapters on the regional approach to North America. But I think one of the most important aspects of this news publication has to do with the methodology. I think it's fascinating the way how we have worked it actually is a work of 6 years. This is the first volume was published in 2020. Then this other project started in 2020, and we are presenting now this second volume on strategic foresight and the matter of this methodology and this approach. I think one of the most important aspects has to do with the fact of that we are not saying what is going to happen. The key argument is what might happen based on the knowledge, based on the trends, and based on major factors that are taking place in some of the most sensitive aspects of the US-Mexico relationship. And one of the key element in this methodology has to do with anticipation. How based on the current trends and dynamics going back from the 19th century, the 20th century, the evolution to the 21st century, and now in November of 2024, we are looking at. We see some kind of consistency in terms of different scenarios about continuation, and between Mexico and the US, and it goes back to the US-Mexican War, and of course it evolves in almost 2 centuries. That aspect is there. Then we also see the need for cooperation and deep interdependence, and the way how we should develop different approaches to overcome differences and engage opportunities in trade, migration, culture, tourism, and even some challenges like organized crime and other threats. Also, a novelty in this book has to do with the fact that we have different cultures on strategic foresight. In the case of the American culture, has more to do with the fact that the US is a great superpower, and the culture of strategic foresight has to do with this fact. While Mexico is more interrelated to Latin American approach, with a different dynamic, even critical to the US, but we have in this book a plurality of approaches of Mexico and the US under this study. Just to mention very rapidly from chapters on trade, migration, climate change and energy, national security and foreign policy, we see in these different approaches that Mexico is part of the US and is rooted to the homeland security, the US homeland security, and how Mexico will try to elaborate different alternative scenarios. I just wanted to mention very rapidly some of these aspects that we have in these chapters, and how this evolves to the US-Mexico relationship, to the regional dimension, as I already figured out, to even in this approach, we have a chapter on China, the US, and Mexico, and the challenges and opportunities that this new relationship has too also, and the impact on this dynamic on the US-Mexico relationship. Something similar in the case of Russia, the US, and Mexico, and the impact on the US-Mexico relationship. Right now, as we see in 2024, November 2024, the emergence of the new presidency in the US is marking a quite important challenge for Mexico. I am about to finish my presentation. I just want to point out some of the more sensitive aspects in terms of these challenges for the US-Mexico relationship. It has to do with the sense of borders. It's in the center of the challenge between Mexico and the US. It's about also the fact of mass deportations, narco-terrorism, and of course there's a major debate of the possibility of a military conflict, pointed out by President-elect Donald Trump. There's a major debate in Washington and in Mexico City about this aspect. And of course, the renegotiation of the United States, Canada, Mexico agreement with Trump's tariff plan. So in this sense, I see as a possible scenarios, just to conclude my presentation, is Mexico contains the US in a negative military conflict with the US, positive Mexico managed to negotiate in its interests and in favor of Mexicans, disrupted a new pandemic comes, or even disrupted the US military conflict with Russia and China. Just in order to conclude, I believe this is more my personal approach to this analysis and to this book, that the major challenges of Mexico and the way how Mexico redefined its policy on national security and foreign policy, and how Mexico redefines also the role of its presence in the US. In this sense, I think in the end, we conclude, the editors, that the future of the US-Mexico relationship has to do with education, culture, and the new generations of students, scholars, think tanks, and places like this. The possibility of increase of a better understanding of Mexico in the US, of a better communication of the US-Mexico, and how the culture and history have a key role of a better understanding between Mexico and the US. So we're pleased that we are having this panel and this dialogue in this beautiful city, and thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. I want to highlight how this strategic foresight methodology allows to study different scenarios when different variables are present, and how at the end they provide a broad range of policy recommendations for the future of the US-Mexico relations. So thank you very much. Next we will listen to Dr. Schiavon for a presentation on Mexican foreign policy and its multi-level diplomacy with the United States.
Well, first and foremost, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you for the hospitality and the generosity, especially at the University of New Mexico, and especially to Professor Francis Hayashida, Director of the Latin American and Iberian Institute. And also thank you, Patricia Pinzón, Consul of Mexico in Albuquerque. And also thank you to each and every one of you for coming here and spending with us your Monday afternoon. I also want to personally thank my professor, Manuel Garcia Griego, who 30 years ago taught me everything I know about IR, the good things, the bad ones I learned by myself. But thank you so much for being here, Professor. I was thinking of using a PowerPoint presentation, but since I only have 10 minutes and I'm timing myself, because there's nothing more dangerous than giving the microphone to an academic. Actually, there is. Giving the microphone to my wife in a karaoke is even more dangerous. She wants to sing the whole night. So what I wanted to say is that this is a unique book, and it was published in the right moment. And the right moment is just after the US election of last November 5th, in which ex-President Trump has been now elected again as president. And also, remember that we had elections in Mexico last June, in which President Claudia Sheinbaum was elected. So it is the right book in the right time, but also in the right place, because being here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center is, I think, the best way in which we can jointly understand better the importance of the United States relationship with Mexico and vice versa. Let me start by saying, how important is the US for Mexico? And I always say that in politics, priorities are measured in budget. And when you see the budget of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Consul Pinzón won't let me lie, approximately 50% of the budget and 50% of the personnel of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs is dedicated to attend two relationships. North America, that is the US and Canada. And the other 50% for 191 other countries. That's how important the US is for Mexico. And let me just give you another number. Mexico has 80 embassies around the world. Just in the US, we have 52 consulates. That means that Mexico has the largest consular network that a country has in another country. And the reason why we've done this, and we've done this since, and here my professor Garcia won't let me lie, we've been doing this since the Porfiriato, is to penetrate the US political system from the bottom up through the consulates. And the secret of Mexican foreign policy, and I know that Consul Pinzón won't like me saying this because it's a secret of Mexican foreign policy. How has Mexico been able to contain US hegemony and at the same time benefit from being the neighbor of the most relevant economy of the last 100 years? Well, by penetrating the US political system through local politics and through consular diplomacy. The secret is that there's 52 Mexican consulates and the Mexican embassy in Washington, D.C. not only do documentation, protection, and attention to our nationals, which are the consular responsibilities, but they are mini embassies in the 52 most important cities in the US. And you think 52, well, probably it is because there are 50 states in the US, and so, no, we have them in the most important cities because we have 11 consulates in Texas, 10 in California, 4 in Arizona, unfortunately only 1 in New Mexico, but if you see 26 out of the 50 Mexican consulates are in the 4 border states. And the reason why is very simple. The most important relationship for Mexico in the world is with the US. Why? Because the US is our first trading partner, and Mexico is the first trading partner of the US. I don't know if you know this, but also because 80% of all our exports come to the US, and 50% of all our imports come from the US, and approximately 50% of all foreign direct investment that Mexico receives comes from the US, and we have 38 million people of Mexican origin living in the US, from which approximately 12 million are first generation, and from those, unfortunately, around 5.2 million are in an irregular migratory situation. They're undocumented workers. So Mexico understands the real importance of having a good relation with the US, but also to push for Mexican interests within the US political system and giving services to this community of 38 million people. And by the way, our connationals in the US sent us $64 billion in remittances last year. That is approximately 4% of Mexico's GDP, and it is higher than the GDP of any Central American country. That's how important remittances are in terms of also providing development for Mexico. So that's why it's so important for Mexico to have a good relationship with the US. And especially at this moment, because what you saw in the election of November 5th is that not only did President Trump win the popular vote and the electoral vote, but he also won majorities in both chambers of the legislature, the Senate 52-48, and the Chamber of Representatives. We still don't have the definitive numbers, but they will have a majority because the Republicans by now have 219 seats. There's still 4 seats to be decided, but with that they have a majority. But what's also most important is that also Republicans, or I would say conservatives, have the Supreme Court of Justice in the US, in which, due to the nominations of the Trump administration, now it changed from being a liberal court to being a conservative court. So that means that President Trump is extremely powerful in terms of defining its domestic policy, but he's also extremely powerful in terms of defining his foreign policy, specifically to Mexico. And here is the moment in which this book is relevant, because what Professor Velasquez and I did, because we wrote the chapter on Mexican foreign policy and US-Mexico relationships in diplomatic terms, is we did this disruptive and catastrophic scenarios, which unfortunately appear to be becoming true after the election of Trump. Professor Velasquez will go deeply into these scenarios. What I would just like to tell you, because I know I'm running out of time, is that the three most important subjects that President Trump has already said will happen within the U.S.-Mexico relationship is, first, security. Yes, it has to do with drug trafficking, it has to do with fentanyl mostly, but most important, there is a threat by the Trump administration of using the military force and U.S. military effectives in Mexican territory, which would be a violation of Mexican sovereignty, also sending missiles into the camps of the cartels, and also considering the cartels as terrorist organizations. So that is a huge threat. Will there be the use of military in Mexican territory? No, it won't. But what we will see is what's already been happening, and that is covert operations. I don't know if you know this, but some months ago, the Chapito, the son of El Chapo, and also one of the leading drug dealers in Mexico, Mayo Zambada, were extracted from Mexico. No one knew how, no one knew what, but they were extracted. And obviously that was a covert operation with some extent of participation, we must assume, from the US. So not necessarily will it be openly intervening in Mexican sovereignty, but we will see this kind of things. Second, in terms of migration, Trump has threatened to deport 1 million undocumented workers every year. And half of all undocumented workers in the US are Mexican. There are approximately 11 million undocumented workers in the US, from which 5.2 million now are Mexican. We all know that it is impossible from an administrative perspective to deport 1 million people a year, but I've talked with several experts on the subject from the US, and they say that they could deport approximately 400,000 people every year. From those, half of them will be Mexican, because half of those undocumented workers in the US are from Mexican origin. So that means they will be deporting approximately 200,000 Mexicans every year. That's a lot. And finally, third, in terms of trade and investment. And as you know, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement is under revision for year 2026. Well, let me tell you, it won't be a revision. It will be a renegotiation, as President Trump has already said. And therefore, there will be the necessity for Mexico and Canada to be able to negotiate with the US to maintain the good parts of the trade agreement and avoid the bad ones. And as you know, the most important thing in Trump's head is this competition vis-a-vis China, and therefore we might see that as currently we have an item in UMSCA that says that Canada and Mexico cannot sign agreements with non-market economies / China. Most probably we'll see in the renegotiation of this agreement that Mexico and Canada won't be able to receive investment from non-market economies / China. So it will get very difficult. And the question is Mexico prepared in terms of foreign policy to contain, as we've done in the course of the last 150 years, US hegemony and benefit from I would like to say yes, because the news are good in terms of, we do have diplomatic infrastructure in the US, as I said, 52 consulates, which work as consulates but also as mini embassies. And Mexico has conducted, at least since the 1930s, what's called multi-level diplomacy. What is multi-level diplomacy? Well, Mexico has understood that in the US, all politics are local politics. And the US is a very porous system, economically, socially, and politically. So Mexico has been able to penetrate the US political, economic, and social system through our web of 52 consulates, but also we work directly, for example, in this multi-level diplomacy with the different relevant actors in the US political, economic, and social systems. For example, we have a direct relationship, obviously, with the State Department, but we also have direct relationship with each and every department in the US, and its counterpart in Mexico works on an everyday basis, and it's called administrative diplomacy, and we do it at least since 1994. And we also have a continuous lobbying in the US Congress, and this is the secret, we not only do it in Washington, we also lobby the senators and the representatives in their local constituencies, because we know what their interests are, and that's why the 52 Mexican consulates are so relevant in terms of building these relationships at the local level, at the local constituencies with the relevant economic actors. But not only that, The consulates also work with the local legislatures, with the majors, with the local media, with the universities. This is a clear example of that, with civil society organizations. So this is the strategy in terms of doing this multi-level diplomacy to push Mexican interests within the US political system to avoid the worst parts of the Trump threats, as we did in, if you remember, in 2017. Trump also said, I'll build a wall and Mexico will pay. Well, the wall was built on behalf of it and we didn't pay for it. He said, well, I'll deport also 1 million people a year. He didn't, etc., etc. So what we need, and here is my final recommendation because I have exactly 6 seconds left, is what should Mexico do? Invest in foreign policy infrastructure. That is, invest more money in promoting more consulates with more resources, with more personnel, and with more capacities to do this multi-level diplomacy in the 52 most important cities. The Mexican Foreign Service is one of the most professional foreign services around the world. I always say that it's one of the 3 best in Latin America, with Brazil and Cuba, which is also has a great foreign service. But the Mexican Foreign Service is great. What it needs is to have a priority within the Mexican government strategies, especially in politics. Priorities are measuring budget. Therefore, what the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs is more budget and personnel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Esquiabon. And I'd like to stress the fact that Mexico has the largest consular network of one country in another, which allows us to work on these 3 main issues Dr. Esquiabon mentions: security, trade, migration, among many others. So thank you very much. Next, we will listen to Dr. Rafael Velázquez Flores on the future of US-Mexico relationship, possible scenarios.
Thank you very much, Consul. I want to thank the Hispanic Center for hosting this panel, this book launch. And I want to also thank Frances Hayashida for organizing this panel to make it happen. Thank you very much, Frances. And I also want to thank Consul Patricia Pinzón for moderating this panel. And I also want to thank my colleagues and friends, Jorge Esquiabon and Abelardo Rodriguez, for accepting to come here to Albuquerque to present this book. And I also want to thank each one of you for being here with us. Well, if you came here to learn what the future of the relationship between Mexico and the US is, well, bad news. We're not going to tell you the future because it's very difficult to predict what could happen. But yeah, we can provide some information about building possible scenarios in the relationship in a very specific methodology that Professor Abelardo Rodriguez has told us. First of all, I think this is a very pertinent exercise to try to discuss these topics because there is a new administration in Mexico already set, and the second term of Donald Trump, which is going to be very difficult to see what really he's going to do in the bilateral relationship with Mexico. Oops, what's this way? Okay. So as I said, it is difficult to predict the future. However, we can make some perspective. And to make some perspective, it means to build future scenarios. But to build future scenarios, we need 4 things. We need to identify past and present tendencies. We also need to make a diagnosis, which means we need to measure quantitative and qualitative variables. We also need to identify driving forces, very important, because these driving forces are going to give us some clue about the different scenarios that we can build. Well, the first point, past and present tendencies, you all agree with me that the relationship between Mexico and the US has been a very complex, due to different perceptions and a few coincidences regarding national interests. It's very difficult in history to find specific moments in which the national interest of the US was very similar to Mexico. For example, I would say that during World War II, the national interests were very similar. You also agree with me that there is a pattern of conflict and cooperation in the bilateral relationship. Mexico has to cooperate with the US because we are neighbors, because our economies are tied together. But there is also some sources of conflict, for example, migration, security issues are in the history has been sources of conflict. The relationship is what I call interdomestic, which means that some of the main issues in the bilateral agenda are domestic, like migration, but they have an international component, like migration or drug trafficking, trade, for example. What about the data? Jorge Schiavon has already told us many statistics about the relationship, mainly in trade and investments. Border crosses, for example, there is a calculation that around 1 million people cross border, some legal, some in irregular form, but I would say that the Mexican border, the US-Mexican border is in the world the most crossed border. There are around 30 million people of Mexican origin that is living in the US. It's been said that we have 22 Mexican consulates in the US. So this information can give us some idea on how to construct future scenarios. What are the main driving forces? First of all, I would say that there is a high level of economic interdependence, which is going to shape the future of the relationship. It doesn't matter if there is a conservative president or a liberal president in Mexico, the economic interdependence is going to function as a force to continue the economic ties between Mexico and the US. Another very important driving force is that we share problems like migration, security, and that's a good driving force to make the governments to cooperate in different issues in the bilateral agenda. There are also security concerns at the border. It's something that the US is paying attention to, and Mexico also, the security issue is very important. That's why we need to cooperate with the US, because we have a very high violence in Mexico, and we need to cooperate with the US in these topics. What are the possible different scenarios that we can construct based on this information that I already gave to you? Well, a possible scenario is that it's not feasible to see extreme changes in the relationship next year. It is clear that Trump will pressure Mexico, but I would think that Sheinbaum administration will cooperate, but both will keep a nationalistic discourse to appease domestic groups. This is very important to understand, because in both countries, governments do the same thing. For example, Donald Trump is having a very harsh discourse on issues like migration or security, but in practical terms, the US is going to search for mechanisms to cooperate with Mexico to deal with these issues. But both countries, both governments are going to keep the nationalistic discourse that they defend sovereignty, that Mexico is expecting respect from the US government, because this is very important for internal policies. There will be deportation, we can expect that, but not in a huge numbers, not a massive deportations. This is a possible scenario. Drug trafficking will be also an important issue. The Donald Trump administration is going to pressure Mexican government to fight against drug cartels. There's going to be a revision of the US and Mexican-Canada trade agreement with some changes. We can see that according to the Donald Trump administration interests. I think that would be very possible. What would be the disruptive scenario? Well, it's indeed under this scenario, extreme changes can be in the bilateral relationship, more conflict, more bilateral conflict. Trump will increase pressure, but the Sheinbaum administration is not willing to cooperate. That would be a very difficult situation between Mexico and the US. There will be deportations in huge numbers, and under this disruptive scenario, Trump probably will tag drug cartels as terrorist groups, and then we're gonna see what Professor Esquiabon already told us, that maybe they are going to, US troops could cross the border to fight the cartels. Maybe the US government could impose very high trade tariffs for Mexican products, and nearshoring will decrease. US investments in Mexico could decrease. So this could be the most disruptive scenario that we can expect in the future. But there is an alternative scenario that could be the combination of the possible and the disruptive scenario. We can see a mix of possible scenarios and disruptive scenarios, because this also depends on internal and external situations. For example, if the domestic situation in Mexico changes, in the domestic situation in the US also changes, that could provide some possible scenarios in the Mexico and the US relationship. So, in the future we can expect some of the information I already talked about. So, we'll see what happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Velázquez, for your presentation. During your presentation, you mentioned the different scenarios that could come up, and you, Dr. Velázquez, Dr. Rodriguez, and Dr. Esquiabon, you analyzed those very carefully in your book, going from the desirable, the unexpected, and other, depending on the variables. So, the first question I'd like to ask you is, after the election, where are we? Dr. Velázquez?
Yeah, thank you very much. We're not in a good situation in the US-Mexican relationship, because if you remember at the end of the López Obrador administration, he set a pause in the bilateral relationship between the Mexican government and the US embassy. This figure doesn't exist in diplomatic relationship, to pause a relationship, to make a pause. Well, that's very strange. This is the first time I hear that the Mexican president establishes this kind of diplomatic figure. And many people think that Claudia Sheinbaum could change the relationship between Mexico and the US, because it was not very good for both countries the relationship at the end of the López Obrador administration. But 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting with the new Mexican Foreign Affairs Minister, and he got together with the diplomatic service accredited in Mexico City. So all the ambassadors from all over the countries in the world were at that meeting, but I didn't see Ken Salazar, who is the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. I didn't see him in the picture. So that's not a good sign in the bilateral relationship if the most important country for the Mexican foreign policy was not there at that meeting. I don't know if he was there, but he was not in the picture. So I think that's not a good sign at the beginning of the Sheinbaum administration. For example, Ken Salazar 2 days ago, last week, he mentioned that the López Obrador strategy of abrazos and no balazos, maybe you understand that, hugs and no guns, it was a failure. Ken Salazar said that 2 days ago or 3 days ago. So, and the Mexican reaction was not very good because they sent a very strange letter saying that we're not going to accept those kind of critics from the U.S. government because that's a domestic issue for the Mexican government. So I think we're not at a good moment right now because the bilateral relationship has not a good start.
Thank you very much, Dr. Velázquez. Dr. Esquiabón, what do you think? Where are we now?
I think we are in one of the most complex moments of the bilateral relationship because it's not only in Mexico and the US, but what we've seen in the course of the last decade, I would say, is an increasing level of fragmentation and polarization, political polarization in the US, in Mexico, and practically in every country in Europe and in Latin America. So if we believe in institutions, if we believe that we can manage our relationship through the institutional basis of the bilateral relationship, things will go smoothly and we will be able to jointly surpass this complicated moment. Why? The reason is simple, because Mexico is the first trading partner of the US, but also the US is the first trading partner of Mexico. Also, Mexico is amongst the first 3 trading partners of 47 of the 50 US states. So we do have so many things that generate this interdependence between the 2 countries in terms of economics. Also, we'll be building these institutions and these capacities in terms of Mexican foreign policy to work with different relevant actors within the US political system. But at the same time, I have to confess that there is a high level of lack of trust between our 2 governments currently. So we do have to work on that. So what would I say? During the first Trump administration, we were finally able to negotiate practically every aspect of the bilateral agenda because President Trump designated professionals to lead the vast majority of the U.S. Ministries, of the U.S. departments. Unfortunately, what I see in this second Trump term is the nomination of people who are directly loyal to President Trump and not necessarily professionals in their areas of expertise within the different ministries or the different agencies in the U.S. So this will make it difficult in terms of having an institutional relationship between Mexico, but it will also make it difficult for managing public policies within the U.S. So let me put it this way. They say that a pessimist is an optimist with information. I still am an optimist. I hope to be wrong, that all the information that we're seeing is leading us to a pessimistic scenario.
Thank you so much for that. And Dr. Rodriguez, what do you think?
Yeah, I think a case of strategic foresight is very useful. This tool terms of the analysis, incoming change. That's crucial. Incoming change means also the level of consistency of this change. Now we are very clear about that the President-elect Donald Trump has won the Electoral College. He won the popular vote. It was very different in 2016. In the case of 2020, he never accepted that he lost in 2020. In 2024, he has majority, of course, in the White House. He has majority in the Senate. He has the majority of governors, the Republican Party. He might have also the House of Representatives. So he has huge power. And of course, in terms and difference of how it used to be in 2016, 2017, he has a strong mandate of several key issues well beyond Democrats and Republicans that are there in the I will say in the Republican conceptual power. That's the change. It's very different of how it used to be a moment ago, 4 years ago, or even in 2016. Very different context. When we were talking with Tony Payana at Rice University and many other scholars from Washington, California, Texas, Guadalajara, Monterrey, Puebla, about the incoming change in 2016, about the Trump administration, it was a kind of mistake in the US history. It wasn't clear. Now, after 3 electoral processes, we know now that it's a general trend that at least in the coming years, in January 20, we're in the context of this transition right now, as we know. The other aspect has to do with the peaks of the cabinet. You know, we have a message, a very strong message of how the policy making will be fairly. We know how the situation was when he was president. As Jorge mentioned, there were several aspects of the political process of how he handled the situation once he was in the White House. Many of the aspects that he wanted to implement wasn't possible, like the border, like the mass deportation, etc. But now it's very different. At least we know what's the trend for the following 4 years. There's going to be a stop in 2 years with the election of the House of Representatives as well. So in this context, I see that how we see the incoming change and the evolution and the threats that in the quiet moment or momentum, these new changes with these new peaks are evolved in November 24 as threats to Mexico. And in the context of Mexico, dealing with the current strategy on national security, I will argue more in the context of national security and the intersection of foreign policy, it's important that the previous policy didn't work. We know that. Mexico has to redefine that policy and do an intersection with the foreign policy, etc. So in that sense, we know also now in the context of national security and public security, there's a continuation with some tactical changes on intelligence, infrastructure, and of course dealing with certain actors in Sinaloa, Michoacan, Tamaulipas, and the Guatemala-Chiapas border. Those are quite critical regions of Mexico. But it has to do with, not only that, it has to do with our role in world politics. The role of Mexico is the only country that shares with the US the southern border, of course. It's the only country on earth. And the opposite side of that is Canada, the northern border. So my point here is that once that we know the power that Trump has, the peaks are coming, and he will be president after January 20, after the inauguration. So we have some time to rethink, to re-elaborate, and to promote the different changes that we need to address in Mexico and in the relationship with the US and our strategic position on global politics as well, and the relationship that we need to have with the United Nations, Latin America, Asia Pacific, with Europe, etc. So in order to try to rebalance this dramatic interdependence that we have with the US. Also, of course, the US has many other aspects that are quite important for Mexico. It has to do with almost everything. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much. It looks like, from what you said, a complex, a challenging, but there's also some optimism in the power of, the belief in the power of institutions, and we'll stay to that and we'll try to rethink the strategy for the coming years. So I am sure there will be many questions from the public, so I'll do one more question and then I'll open it for the public. So in your book, you describe the US-Mexico relation as one with an inertia difficult to alter and with specific characteristics such as special, asymmetric, interdependent, complicated, and intense. How likely is that those characteristics change or adjust within this new era? Dr. Esquiaban.
Okay, I'll start. I would use one word to summarize all the adjectives that you use. And the Mexico-US relationship is intermestic. What does intermestic mean? That domestic politics are relevant for international politics. What happens in US domestic politics is extremely relevant for the US-Mexico relationship, but also what happens within the Mexican domestic politics is extremely relevant for the bilateral relationship. Therefore, what we see is that this characteristic of intermestic relationship will continue. However, the way we manage this intermestic relationships is the one which will lead us to more cooperation and a better situation for both countries, or unfortunately, increasing conflict.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rodriguez?
Yes, I will add to that. There is very different dynamic of what used to be the US-Mexico relationship right after the end of the Cold War. The US was the superpower. After the end of the Cold War, there was the negotiation of NAFTA, the integration process, and 34 years after that processes, we know that the situation is very different. Now we are under a multipolar dynamic. The US no longer the superpower, just lonely superpower on Earth. And also there are many other global dynamics as well. So in that context is even more challenging for Mexico now that, in the case, for example, Russia has a view on the Western Hemisphere through the Arctic, in the context of what the Arctic means for them and the tension that they have with Canada in the Arctic, with the US in the Arctic, as well in the Western Hemisphere. The type of relationship that they have with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Those are very strong relationships. They are here. They have a strong approach to the Western Hemisphere, and it's clear that they are in this global competition with the US. First. Second, China. China is a fascinating subject of analysis. You know, they are looking for the next century. They're working on that. They are investing on that. The culture, science, technology, and even if you compare the US history and the China history, when you approach the China's domain, you were talking about a civilization for at least 5,000 years. This is the way how they address policy and how they are moving their power, and they are here. It's quite different in the case of Mexico, but it's clear that they have a Western Hemisphere approach to through Central America and South America, and they are very strong right now. We were talking about this, Jorge, in Peru. What is the southern cone in Central America? Mexico is a key piece under that domain. So my point here is that we're talking about their different dynamic of what it used to be 30 years ago, 50 years ago, or what it used to be before 9/11 or after 9/11. And the disruption that it meant, the pandemic for the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So in this sense, the approach is this asymmetry of power, these interdomestic dynamics that my colleagues were talking about, like trade, like migration, like security, etc., but also the global dimension. So that's a quite challenging dimension, and of course a series of different opportunities, but when we were talking about the research project of this book with Tony and Richard Kilroy, is that it's no longer possible to look at the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but it used to be 100 years, or it used to be 50 years ago, or 30 years ago. We need to do the intersections of these levels of analysis, the global dimension, the regional dimension, the Western Hemisphere dimension, and of course, where the critical aspect of this is the interdomestic bilateral regional approach.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Velázquez?
Yeah, thank you. I don't see important changes in these characteristics. Interdependence is going to continue, that's for sure. But maybe we can see some adjustments in both countries in terms of policy. For example, the US needs a stable Mexico in terms of trade. There are many products, US products that are sold in Mexico. The US also needs a stable border, a security border. So those are incentives for the US to cooperate with Mexico. There was an old saying in the Mexican foreign policy analysis, which was said by Professor Mario Ojeda, that in the US-Mexico relationship there is an agreement to disagree, which means this, that the US is going to allow Mexico to project an dependent foreign policy towards Latin America, towards the Caribbean, towards Central America, because that was good for the Mexican political system, because the PRI was also last century, the pre-government used foreign policy to get some legitimacy, because the PRI didn't have too much democratic legitimacy. And that foreign policy was good for the Mexican government to create some consensus, domestic consensus, to have a stable political system in which that was very good for the US, because Mexico was able to cooperate. So in this case, I would think that we're gonna see something very similar, in which Mexico is going to adjust their policies to solve some bilateral problems with the US. And if the US government realizes that Mexico is willing to cooperate, I think the pressure could be less, but we're gonna see a lot of pressure of the US government, mainly in migration and security issues.
Thank you very much. So I'll summarize those impressions with the term Dr. Esquialan used of interdomestic, with new actors in the arena that may impact to some extent this interdependence. So now, if I may, I'll open it to the public, and I'll ask that before you ask, you introduce yourselves, and in case you want to mention the institution you are representing. Dr. Montoya?
Yes, hello, thank you very much. My name is Manuel Montoya. I'm an associate professor in the economics department here at UNM. Thank you very much for all of your insight and for sharing this important starting and foundational way of looking at prospective futures for these two countries. Something that Dr. Rodriguez said is something I wanted to build upon. Often when we look at bilateral relations, they're very short-term or reactive-oriented in terms of political cycles. But looking at the 100-year view of these relationships, can each of you identify one thing that would make Mexico reorient itself to the United States, and one thing that would reorient itself to perhaps supra-regional powers? And what I mean by that are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, or even MINT, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. Those are supra-regional identities that are forming in the 21st century that aren't part of the old paradigms of bilateral relationships. So again, what is one thing in the next 100 years that would reorient Mexico to the United States, and one that would reorient us to BRICS or MINT or something else that is kind of globally supra-regional?
Who wants to take that? Dr. Rodriguez.
This is a fascinating subject because we know it's, there's a major debate right now in Mexico taking place in several arenas. But one common consensus, I don't know if it's very clear, is that we belong to North America. It's our home, even beyond, or of course before the existence of the US, Canada, and Mexico. It goes back to dinosaurs, to the era of dinosaurs 10 million years ago. The creation of oceans, the shared space, air, space, the continents, endemic species that we share. So in that sense, our home is North America. That is very clear, and it has to do with geography, it has to do with resources, environment, life, cellular communities of every kind. That goes beyond, and we expect that in the next 100 and probably 1,000 years, our home is here in terms of rivers, mountains, you name it. That will be one crucial aspect because that's vital for national security, regional security, and of course foreign policy. That's crucial to understand. Secondly, it has to do also with the sense of decision-making process in Mexico. And the Mexican Constitution argues that the Mexican presidency is the key actor on national security and foreign policy. If you see the evolution in the last 100 years, depending on the president, like the case of Lázaro Cárdenas, that he has approached to the former Soviet Union, to the Soviets, then depending on, for example, Carlos Salinas de Gortari man decided that we should have the integration that we have under NAFTA. The process moved in that direction. Then, with the inauguration of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that, for example, even in his own autobiography, he was an actor that he admired the Cuban Revolution, he admired a check written by him, and it's very special to look at the difference between the approach of the Mexican presidency towards the Trump administration. He tried to engage, continue towards impersonal approach, president to president. Right after he left the White House and with the Biden administration, it was a tactical change toward Cuba, Venezuela, and Brazil. He belongs to the Sao Paulo group. He was the inauguration in Mexico City in 1991. The first Sao Paulo group was in 1990 in Sao Paulo. And of course, you have three major components there. That is the critique to the imperial domain of the US, anti-neoliberalism, and anti-colonialism, with different approaches of what several Latin American presidents used to argue vis-a-vis the US. To some extent, there's a kind of continuation of the current presidency. Lázaro Cárdenas, Batel, is now in the National Palace, the great-grandson. So this, to me, we have this interdomestic dynamics, of course, but there are these geopolitical changes depending on the presidency that we have in Mexico, that even the Russian president was invited to the inauguration of the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. So my point here is that the international system is changing, the dynamic is changing, but depending on the key actors in the National Palace, how they try to reshape or adjust the move of Mexico in world politics. Of course, again, I will finish my comment that the fact, I think it was very clear, Claudia Sheinbaum arguing that the priority for Mexico is North America and the relationship with the US. I think she was very clear about that.
Can I say something? It was a great question. I would say that for the last 100 years, as Professor Velázquez said, there is continuity in terms of cooperation between Mexico and the US, mostly to guarantee the most relevant priority of US foreign policy, which is national security. Mexico has worked closely with the US during the Second World War, during the Cold War. I would say that we do have a game changer in the bilateral relationship, and that is the signing of NAFTA. NAFTA, the free trade agreement, is a game changer because Mexico and the US changed from being distant neighbors to becoming partners. So that is a game changer in the relationship. What could be a new game changer in the next 100 years if this broke up? And I think that it will be very difficult, at least Mexico will do whatever it can to avoid this increasing integration in terms of economics, which is also generating all other types of integration. And just to give you two examples, Mexico was invited to join the BRICS at January of this year. And López Obrador immediately said, no, we're not interested. We are a North American country and there's our priority. And then during the summer, we were invited to the G77 summit, the non-aligned countries and China, which is the new movement, to also become a member. And I said once again, immediately, no, we are a North American country. So our identity is clearly, probably historically and culturally, yes, Mexico is also Latin American, but in terms of our economic interests and in terms of geography, we are North American, and that will not change.
This is a fascinating topic and subject. In terms of the bilateral relationship, is one dimension. When we go to, for example, world politics, in the case of the Mexican mission in the United Nations, it's fascinating the way how they approach the multilateral approach in terms of, and I think that's crucial for Mexico in terms of dealing and talking to everyone. That I think that's a characteristic of the Mexican foreign policy. They talk with Russians, Chinese, Indian, Africans, Latin Americans, and that is, I think, that's very, very important in terms of international security and global security. But in the end, again, in terms of interdependence, trade, human mobility, guns, has to do again, it goes back to the center of the US-Mexico relationship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate being in the presence of real public servants. It means a lot. If Americans were prohibited from traveling to Mexico, how, if any, impact would that have on Mexico's economic security?
I can give you just the numbers. It would cost Mexico $23 billion. Why? Because that's the amount of money we receive from tourism from North America. I don't know how much is Canadian, how much is the US. Let's say 70% of that is from the US. So it would be a huge impact in terms of the Mexican economy.
Yes, yes.
Oh, I want to congratulate the three panelists for a book that deals with this issue from a very broad perspective and then considers different scenarios, and your presentations have been quite stimulating and thought-provoking. I want to bring you down from the 30,000-foot level a little bit and frame a question from a different perspective, and that is, for many years, Mexico was concerned about pressure from the United States in terms of the possibility that the United States might link across different issue areas, for example, trade and migration, in order to obtain certain concessions from Mexico. In general, the response that people gave to that kind of consideration was, it's very hard to unify these actions within the United States government. The US policy process is very fragmented. There are many different power centers in the federal government. You have state governments and so forth and so on. And unless the president makes it a priority, it's going to be very difficult to get coordination across, let's say, from the Defense Department to Homeland Security to Department of Justice and so forth. Well, now you have, I think, a president who has made that a priority and has explicitly mentioned Mexico, and particularly mentioned not just deportations, but also trade as a significant priority for his administration. Our experience in the United States is that when people run for president and when they make very visible campaign promises, they make a serious effort to carry them out. So my question is, you were talking about multi-level diplomacy, and that's a very important characteristic of the US-Mexican relationship that makes it very distinct from many other kinds of relationships. You stress the, huge number of Mexican consulates in the United States. I assume your book goes into this, you probably didn't have time to talk about state-to-state relations, the importance of Texas, California, and so forth, even cities and so on, sanctuary cities. California is a sanctuary state, and so on. So there are all sorts of different, multiple levels, quite apart from private actors and nonprofit organizations and so forth. I wonder whether you dealt with two particular and very distinct kinds of things to consider. One would be political parties. Normally, in the United States, foreign policy has not been a partisan issue, but I think now we can expect a very different kind of dynamic. And particularly, I think you can expect a very different response from Democratic governors than from, let's say, Republican governors on issues that have to do with migration, deportation, and so forth. Another level, and this relates to the migration issue, is, and I didn't hear you mention it, but it's probably talked about in your book, is third country nationals. Increasingly, you have people still think that it's, agricultural workers from Jalisco crossing into, Tijuana to go to work in the fields in the Imperial Valley. It's actually, more often Guatemalans seeking asylum, Venezuelans, Cubans, and people from the Middle East and other countries, Ukrainians going through Mexico and so forth. So how, in view of the possible pressures with respect to not just deportation, but border enforcement, attempts by the US government to try to pressure Mexico to violate its own constitution with respect to free transit, of people. I'm curious what you see as the mechanisms that would be important in that kind of response.
I do have lots of information because since I learned from you the relevance of migration, I've been studying in the last year or so. I can give you some answers to that. Also, from my last books, 7 of them have been on para-diplomacy. What is para-diplomacy? International relations of subnational governments. Actually, my last book on para-diplomacy is called The International Relations of California and Texas with Mexico and the World. So Mexico has understood that, that's why we have these 52 consulates, that it's relevant not only to work with the federal government, but to work with subnational governments. Mexico has 1,094 interinstitutional agreements, which are the treaties, or the equivalent of a treaty, that subnational governments can sign. From those, 30% are signed with the US. And from those, 70% are signed either with Texas or with California. Unfortunately, we don't have a close relationship with New Mexico. From the 4 border states, Mexico has a very intense relationship with California and with Texas. A mild relationship, I would say, with Arizona. But there, the Arizona-Sonora Commission, which has existed since 1957, is extremely important. But with Mexico, it's very difficult to establish a relationship because of this, how would I say? I see that in New Mexico, you have this idea more of a Hispanic heritage than a Mexican heritage. And to a large extent, at least, it makes it difficult, I think, to establish a closer relationship with New Mexico. But you're the experts, and you'll tell me whether I'm wrong or I'm right. And now, in terms of migration, you won't believe these numbers, but here's Professor Garcia Diego to say if I'm wrong. In 2010, net migration from Mexico to the US was 0. That is, more Mexicans were coming back than Mexicans going to the US. Why? Because obviously it was more difficult, more expensive, more dangerous to cross to the US, but also because conditions in Mexico were much better. So people, migrants are rational people, so they decide to do the migration flows when it's good for them. And also at that time, in 2010, 92% of all migrants in transit through Mexico coming into the US, 92% were from 3 nationalities: Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Today, there are over 110 nationalities crossing Mexico to try to go into the US in an irregular fashion, and the vast majority of them are from 4 countries, which are Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti. The problem is that the US cannot deport these nationals to their countries of origin because there is no government in Haiti, and there are not very good relationships with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. So the Mexican government accepted to serve as a 3rd secure country and receive deportations from the US to Mexico of 30,000 nationals every month of these 4 countries, which is against international law. You cannot deport a national of a country to another country, even if that country is considered a 3rd safe country. And also, you know the Remain Mexico program. All those people who are requesting asylum, the refugee status in the US, but have crossed the US-Mexico border to request the refugee status, have to remain in Mexico while they are in their judicial process, which takes over 2 years, as you know, because there's a huge backlog in terms of refugee courts in the US, and only somewhere between 1.5 and 3% of those who request refugee status obtain it in the US. That means that all these people are staying in Mexico, and the vast majority of them, somewhere from between 99 to 97%, will stay in Mexico because they won't be able to obtain the refugee status in the US, or they might also try to get in an irregular way to the US if they're not receiving the refugee status. So to give a short answer to your question, yes, the border is becoming a very critical place because the U.S. is not fulfilling its international commitments in terms of migration, especially in terms of refugee and in terms of deportations. And Mexico is doing the dirty job. Mexico is doing the dirty job in terms of containing migration flows, detaining migrants and deporting them to the countries of origin, and those who have already been deported from the U.S. receiving some status of refugee in Mexico based on this negotiation between Mexico and the U.S. So the U.S. is going against international law, and Mexico is paying the price.
Thank you, Dr. Esteban. We are over the time, so I'll take the last two questions together, and then I'll ask the panelists to answer both together, along with a final comment, please, to end the session. So I'll go with the question, sir.
Patricia Gonzalez, Professor of Sociology, Emeritus here at the UNM. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas on this extremely important topic. So in the analysis of what could possibly happen and in possible scenarios, there is the tendency to try to come up with probabilities. What are the chances that a certain scenario might happen? Now, I have a very good friend, David Montejano, retired from the University of California, Berkeley, who has painted a scenario of military intervention in the United States upon Mexico. And I've spoken to David about this, and he feels pretty strongly that, the chances are that there could very well be military action on the part of the Trump administration. He has all the support for it. There have been U.S. senators who have raised this idea. And so it seems like for many policymakers, there's certainly people who work in the area of American international policy that this could happen. My question to you is, what do you think are the probabilities, the chances that there could be, that the United States could exercise some military intervention in Mexico? I guess there are two very important ideas that can start sort of criticism, not only in the narco issue, but judicial reform that was started by Congress. So that's my question to you. What do you think?
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. If I may, I'll take the second question. Robert?
Sure. Robert Connolly, member of the Republic for Kenya. So I love your enthusiasm, Dr. Scale, about the subnational developments that are happening across the border. And Mexico's very well articulated consular structure. But I wonder if there's a need, because the United States is such an important partner, to have a discussion perhaps with other kinds of elites in this country. I think a lot about other kinds of elites. I think of Israel. Israel is such a powerful lobby in this country that we don't have to go into detail, but they can choose which Democrats they don't like to get primaried. And that probably runs against Mexico's foreign policy history and tradition. But I'd like to know if there's a need for a higher level of dialogue so that our elites can better understand the fruitfulness of the relationship with Mexico.
Thank you. Last question from Mariana.
Buenas tardes, Mariana Santos. Soy mexicana, jarocha orgullosamente. And my question is, what do we do with the right arising? Because we are witnessing moments of a lot of change. We see Bolsonaro, Milei, and we see a lot of the right wing arising all over the world, and it's concerning. And it's concerning mainly because United States and Trump is the face of racism. And I say from my story, from my history, but also because I work for a nonprofit and I do community work at the detention centers, and I know how these people are being treated. And even though they're from Venezuela, Colombia, etc., they're my brothers and sisters, right? So I see that it's not only a speech of racism, it's una estratagema, and it's like this racism is being applied directly and victimizing and criminalizing us. So just that, like, what is the role of the United States as being the face of the right? And that's it. Thank you.
Should I start?
Please.
The answer to your question is very easy. The probability 0.00001 of direct military intervention. However, what we will see will be increasing pressures for more cooperation between Mexican and U.S. armed forces, and the expert is right here, and he can tell you how. We can also see increasing covert operations. But direct intervention, 0.000, and as many zeros as you want, 0.1. Robert, the elites, yes. Mexico works very closely through the consulates, through this network of consulates, with the local elites, mostly with business people, with civil society organizations, with churches, with the media, and with universities. And we've done this since the 1930s. So Mexico tries to build this strategic alliances with relevant actors within the US. Let me just give you an example. The Trump administration on the first, in January 2019 said that NAFTA was the worst treaty ever signed by the US, and that he was on the first day going to throw it to the garbage. Well, he couldn't. And he couldn't because there were egotistical allies of Mexico this side of the border, which had benefited incredibly by NAFTA, and therefore there was a renegotiation. So that will happen to a large extent, I think, with many of the policies of the Trump administration. And finally, Mariana, let me put it this way. I'm not that concerned anymore between left and right. I think that doesn't help today. What we see is a new dimension, which is what I would call the liberal Democrats, institutionalists, those which believe in institutions and believe in democracy, and believe in liberal democracy, and populism. And that is what's dangerous, because populism destroys institutions. And if you destroy institutions, then there is this direct link between the leader and the people, but with no capability of constraint and checks and balances. And that's very dangerous. So I'm not that concerned about left and right today. I'm more concerned about populism.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez.
Yes, very rapidly. I think from the first Trump administration, it was very clear the way how they come up with a type of consistency in terms of policy when they added migration, organized crime, and terrorism to the same equation on U.S. national security for the Trump administration. It's clear that it's going to be a kind of a second momentum on dealing with that, and that is since the beginning of the first Trump administration. It was there, a series of different policies, and I think that's very perverse, because also that is added to trade and the borders, the protection of the borders. That is in the policy. And that is coming again. I believe that it's coming with even more force. That will be my first comment to that aspect. Secondly, about the military action or possibility. We don't know if that is going to happen. We don't know if that is going to happen. But from a strategic foresight, from the Mexican national security, defense policy, intelligence, communities that we studied this, we need to play with this scenery. We need to have, actually, well, the armed forces, they have it. We don't know if that is going to happen, but we need to take that into account as a probability and a possibility, since President Trump has argued that. So that's a scenario. It will be catastrophic, negative. If that goes back to the 19th century, even to the 20th century, it hasn't taken in the last 100 years. But if we go back to the foundation of this country and about the sense of order, going back to the Declaration of Independence and the founding fathers and the way how they conceived the more perfect union and the concept of the American government goes back to the type of border that is not a static border. In more than 200 years, we're talking about a very volatile border in the 19th century, in the 20th century, during the Cold War, and right after 9/11.
And during the Mexican Revolution.
Of course, the Mexican Revolution. It's a very dynamic border. We just go back to the history and we have plenty of examples. The border is back with all the force. Now under this administration, and this, well, with the President-elect Trump, of course, the presidency is under the Biden administration. And in the first term, the previous administration argued that the most sensitive aspect of the U.S. role in the world has to deal with Mexico. So, in that sense, I think that we better prepare Mexico from all different perspectives. Is how we can anticipate this scenario. What are the strategies that Mexico will have to do? I think that we have to take into account looking at a different strategy, looking at Friends of Mexico, looking at the Pentagon, looking at the U.S. Congress, looking at the military-to-military relationship. There are many actors in the U.S. side that they, of course, don't share that view. We are talking about a decision that has to do with the commander-in-chief, that is the president, the U.S. president. So my point here is that I don't say that that is going to happen. The argument here is that we need to have that trend in the horizon. That was impossible 30 years ago to think about it, to talk about that. And a final comment on the right. I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned about that. Because in the US, we're talking about many different subjects of that. Of course, as an observer of the conservatives, the New Right, the Christian Coalition, taking into account what happened in El Paso, Texas, and even Charlottesville, it's better that we take into account that new momentum also in the U.S. and the transformation in the U.S. in that sense, that we better invest more in knowledge, research on what's going on in the U.S. And finally, also from a Mexican perspective, I think that we need to look at all the sources of soft power in the U.S. Universities, think tanks, communities, friends of both countries, liberal order, multilateral organizations. So there are many, millions of them that I think we can work with. And of course, the new generations.
Thank you very much. Dr. Velasquez, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't think we're going to have a U.S. military intervention in Mexico, at least in the short term. For example, there are two authors, Joseph Nye and Robert Q. Henry, wrote a book about interdependence. And one of the main ideas there is that the more interdependent both two countries are, the less possibility of military interventions is. So I would think that that case is not going to happen, at least in the short term. Trump, in the first term, he wanted to tag the drug cartels as terrorist groups, but he couldn't do it. And for example, in the 80s, there was a plan in the US to intervene in Mexico because of drug trafficking. If you remember the Quique Camarena case, that was a huge diplomatic crisis between Mexico and the US. Distrust was the main issue there. And there were some plans in 1985 to intervene in Mexico, but at the end, I don't want to say this, but thanks to the earthquake in Mexico in 1985, those plans were cancelled. So I don't think it's possible, at least in the short term, because if Trump sends troops to Mexico, it's like Hitler sending troops to Poland. So it's not a good image for the US to invade the neighbor in terms of image abroad. Okay, second many years ago, there was this idea that the Mexicans can lobby in the US, not only in the Senate, many governmental offices. But it was very difficult for Mexicans to do that because the cause of migration. For example, Cuban Americans were very successful to lobby in the US government, for example, for the sanctions to Cuba, to keep sanctions to Cuba. But that was a different cause of migration. They came to the US for political reasons. Mexicans come here for economic reasons mainly. So it was very difficult. And besides, the Mexicans here were not very united maybe 30 years ago. But now I think that many couldn't vote, so they were not very influential. But now I think Mexico has a very good opportunity to try to create that lobby. And that could be a mechanism to restrain Donald Trump in certain policies. Because we're not going to lobby the president, we're going to lobby some US institutions that are in charge of that kind of decisions. And thirdly, yes, we have a problem of racism here in the US, and I think it's because there is this wrong perception that migrants are a threat to the US economy, to the US culture. So what we need to do, mainly the Mexican government, mainly consulates here, is what we call public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is to get in contact to the people of other countries, not the other government, the people, the society. And the main idea or the main objective of public diplomacy is to improve the image of the country. So what we need is to implement these kind of policies to improve Mexico's image or migrant image here in the US. It's going to be very difficult because there's a very conservative sector here in the US that is not going to change their mind about that, but we need to do so. But as Jorge Esquivón said, if we need to develop this public diplomacy, we need money to do that. We need budget. Unfortunately, Jorge Esquivón didn't say it, but this year there's a cut in the budget of the Mexican Foreign Ministry. So it's going to be very difficult under these situations to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Velázquez. Before I turn it back to Zach to close this panel, I just want to thank one more Dr. Frances Hayashida for this conversation and she has been such a great ally of Mexico, and that's what we need, more conversations like this. Thank you to our panelists and to the audience. Remember, there's a discount code in your flyer so that you can get this amazing book. Zach, thank you for hosting us, and please, the floor is yours to close our panel.
Gracias, Consul. Well, thank you so much, familia. What an exciting talk, you know. We do live in exciting times, and you can take that however which way you want. But we're just happy to be able to host this conversation here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. And con respecto de mi familia, Professor Esquivón, I'd be happy to show you a little bit about New Mexico history here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center and how much Mexican exactly we are. Gracias. Y también, moving forward, these are the kind of conversations you can expect for community collaborations among our university systems, given the fact, not just because we're the only National Hispanic Cultural Center in the entire United States of America, think about that. Just for a second panel, as we talk about the identity and the purpose and the scope of Latinos, Hispanos, gente, there's only one National Hispanic Cultural Center in the entire United States. Wrap that into foreign policy. No sé. ¿Sabes qué? Why are we so special? Something to think about, food for thought, you know? But for future collaborations, please look towards our website, please visit the Consul, please be able to visit the Latin American Iberian Institute. Again, gracias Director for pulling together such a powerhouse panel and such an incredible conversation, and I look forward to reading the book thoroughly as well. Gracias.